Hello, everybody. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names, and it's exciting to hear that you're visiting us from around the world. This is the first in our series devoted to professional development. And my name is Leah Markey. I'm the director of the Center for Renaissance Studies at the Newberry, or virtual Newberry. And as you know, today we'll be talking about online pedagogy. Note that the next session is devoted to publishing, and we just sent our email this morning to sign up for it, and we hope to see you there as well. In August, our seminars will cover grant writing and jobs outside academia. I also wanted to alert you all that we'll be recording, so if you don't want to be seen in the recording, feel free to turn your video off. Our seminar today will last about an hour, and those of you who wish to stay on to ask a few more questions are welcome to for another 15 minutes. So I'll first introduce you to Elisa Jones, and then she will introduce you to Melissa Wong and begin their conversation. So it's my great pleasure and honor to introduce you to Elisa J. Jones. She's a historian of early modern France and the history of rights, who has recently taught at the University of Chicago, DePaul University, and Purdue University Northwest. She has 13 years of experience teaching online. In addition to an MA in history from Catholic University of America and a PhD in history from the University of Chicago, Elisa is currently completing MS coursework at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign School of Information Sciences and Digital Humanities and the History of the Book, as well as working on digital projects for the Center for Renaissance Studies. Dr. Jones just completed a postdoctoral fellowship in our Renaissance Center. We're sad to see her move on, but thrilled that she's joining the Department of History at the College of Charleston as an assistant professor this fall. Thank you.
Leah, I've been so blessed to work with all of you. I want to introduce to you all today Melissa Wong, who is a librarian and an instructor, and I can tell you from personal experience that she is phenomenal online as an instructor, and you are very lucky to have her with you today. Melissa has more than 20 years of experience teaching online. She's an award-winning instructor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She teaches courses in instruction, in e-learning, in higher education, and reference. She has literally written the textbook on instructional design for LIS professionals, published in 2019, and she's a co-editor of the recent volume, Reference and Information Services, an Introduction. Thank you so much for joining us here, Melissa, in this conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. It's always so much fun to talk about pedagogy, especially online pedagogy. I feel like as stressful as the pandemic has been, it's also been kind of an exciting time for me because so many people are now newly interested in teaching online. And I love talking to people about teaching online and how great it can be and how engaging it can be if that's the classroom that we're trying to create, right? So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are logging in from. I work for the University of Illinois, but I actually, because I teach in their online program, I live in Southern California with my family. So hello to those of you fellow Californians who are here today. Because we're talking about online pedagogy today, Elisa and I really wanted to model some of the teaching strategies that we'll be discussing. So as a first step toward that, we really encourage you to use the chat throughout the session. I realize that sometimes in webinars, the expectation is that the presenter is going to lecture and the audience will sit and listen and there'll be a designated Q&A time. But when I teach in the classroom, I want to be engaging with my students throughout the class, right? So we use the chat the entire time. And I really encourage you today, you are welcome to comment on what we're saying. You can ask questions, which we might pause and answer, or we may realize we're going to answer a little bit down the road. You're welcome to share your own ideas with one another. We'd really like this to be a time when it's not just Elisa and I giving you ideas, but that you can share ideas with each other as well. Elisa and I are planning to talk for about 25 minutes today. We have a presentation, we have a few activities, and then we'll have a lot of time, probably about 30 minutes or so, for questions and discussion. And you can see that I've got a set of slides here. There was a title slide. Oh, what I do want to give you though is, and I can paste this into the chat later as well, but we have a Google folder with all of the materials from today. So there's a copy of the slides if you would like that to look at after the session. And then there is also a resource list. So some of the authors that we're going to mention today, some of the technologies that we're going to mention today, those are in that resource list that's in the Google folder that you can access. And then we're going to start with an activity. We're going to start with a poll using a really fun free tool called Answer Garden. And I'm going to put that link in the chat for you. And when you click on this link and you go to Answer Garden, you'll see a copy of the poll question as well, which is, how do you feel about teaching online this fall? And just enter a one-word answer, whatever it is. And once you've answered it once, if you want, you can answer with a different word. So if you have mixed feelings, you are welcome to share those mixed feelings as well. And you'll see, once you start answering, that we're going to create a word cloud. And if you're done putting in your own words, you can hit refresh occasionally, and the word cloud will keep growing and changing as more people answer. To Claire's question, you are welcome to share the resource list with colleagues, absolutely. Melissa, the poll, you have to follow the link. Let me give it to you again. And if you click on that, it should take you to the Answer Garden link. And then you put your answer to the poll in Answer Garden. And give people another 30 seconds or so to answer. I want to mention, I love Answer Garden. It is free. You don't even need an account. You go set up your poll. It takes about 30 seconds. There are a couple of criteria, how long the answers can be, a little bit about what you want the results to look like. There is a filter for offensive language. I don't use that, so I don't know how well it works. I work with graduate students. I usually don't have a problem with offensive language, but there is a filter if you're concerned. The polls stay active for about a week. So if we look at our results, and again, if you hit refresh, you'll see the most recent results. It looks like we've got folks who are excited and curious. Hopeful is a fantastic feeling right now, but I also see we have some folks who feel anxious and nervous, and I think that that's really normal, right? Okay, so the question is, why is this a better option than polls in Zoom? So Zoom polls tend to be multiple choice. And I do use Zoom polls with my students, but you're picking the answers and you get a percentage of how many people answered A, B, C. I like Answer Garden because it's a little more free-flowing and it creates this really fun word cloud. The bigger the word, the more often it was mentioned by participants. So it's just a kind of a slightly different way of doing some of that polling and interaction. And then what I do with the results is you can kind of use it like we're doing today to take the temperature of a class. You could use it to brainstorm responses, to maybe a reading or a primary source document that you're looking at, right? Or maybe a video that students had to look at. You can use it for some kind of brainstorming activity. And then I often in class use it as a jumping off point for additional discussion with my students. So a couple things really to take away from this. An example of just how we can add that interaction in class. This quick poll doesn't take a lot of time, but it gets students thinking and contributing. And then it gives us this, again, jumping off point for discussion. And then specifically, I do like Answer Garden. There are lots of polling tools out there. Whatever system you're using, Zoom, Blackboard, Collaborate, typically we'll have some simple polling tools built in, or you can find some on the web that you can use as well. And I do not know what each student said on the Answer Garden. It doesn't give us that level of detail. So this is really going to be better for just a quick casual in-class activity. If I wanted something where I could track back individual answers, I would probably use my course management system instead, or something like, well, I wouldn't use Google. Some people do use Google, and it's okay if you're using it anonymously. You have to be careful about putting student names in there. It is not sometimes considered fully FERPA compliant, but there are some other tools that you might be able to use, especially again in your course management system, or your institution might provide you with access to something. Yeah, and anonymous can be great, right? Because it does lower the stakes. Amy, if I want to save the word cloud, I take a quick screenshot. And also they do stay up for about a week. So even if you accidentally close it in class, you can open it up after class and grab your screenshot then. Yeah, which is nice if you want to save that element of the class conversation. Okay, so, online teaching is kind of a big, complicated thing, right? There are a lot of aspects of online teaching that we could talk about, but what we really wanted to focus on today is student engagement and interaction. Humanities instruction has always prioritized interaction in the classroom, and as we move our classrooms online, Elisa and I felt that our time today would best be used looking at ways that we can continue to create opportunities for that meaningful class interaction. So we're going to present a quick framework, and then we are going to share some ideas for building an interaction in both synchronous and asynchronous models of instruction. Elisa, to answer your question regarding WebEx or another platform, I think it's really important that you use whatever platform your institution is supporting. Even though a lot of people are used to Zoom and it's very popular, it's not actually my favorite platform necessarily for teaching. So some of these other platforms are really strong as well. And also it adds to students' sense of being overwhelmed if every class is using something different. So I do think it's important to be consistent, use the platform students are used to using, and also it's probably the platform that if they have trouble, they're going to be able to get tech support on campus for it. Right, and that's important as well. So, I think in a lot of ways those platforms are all fairly similar, and they all have a few strengths and weaknesses. But I would use what your institution is using. All right. So, this framework of 3 types of interaction, originally proposed by Moore back in 1989, if you can believe it, and validated with a meta review by Bernard et al. In 2009. Moore suggested that effective, engaging online classes have 3 types of interaction: student-to-content interaction, student-to-student interaction, and student-to-instructor interaction. And I found this to be a really fruitful framework for thinking about the structure of my own courses, whether I'm thinking about the entire semester or whether I'm thinking about a unit or even a day, right? What are we doing to interact with the content of the week? What are we doing for students to interact with me in a meaningful way? And in what ways are my students having opportunities to interact with and learn from one another? One of the nice things about that Bernard et al. Meta review is that they found evidence that this framework of the 3 types of interaction supports learning, so better learning outcomes for students, which of course is what we're concerned about, but it also supports student motivation and student retention. And we do know that retention in online courses can sometimes lag behind face-to-face courses a little bit. That research is a little bit complex because there's a lot of factors that go into retention, but I think we are right to be concerned about retention. And so having this framework that touches on student learning and motivation and retention, again, feels really fruitful to me. So let's talk about what this might look like in synchronous instruction. Remember, when we say synchronous instruction, we are talking about real-time online sessions like what we're doing in Zoom today, where everybody's coming together at the same time to learn and interact. So some of the advantages of having synchronous instruction, it may allow you to reuse some of your existing lesson plans. If you feel like you've got really great content from previous semesters, you often can move those over to a synchronous session with a little bit of tweaking, which is really nice. It allows for real-time discussion and interaction, gives you a chance to answer student questions, and it's a great opportunity to build a learning community within your class. If you're looking at synchronous instruction, of course, you do want to be aware of any institutional either requirements for synchronous instruction or scheduling of synchronous instruction, or conversely, if they're discouraging synchronous instruction. So a few tips if you are going to offer synchronous sessions. The first one is that they need to add value to your course beyond just lecture. If all you're going to do is lecture, you could have recorded that and let students watch it at their convenience. So there's really no reason to get together all at the same time just to lecture. When you do it, I would really encourage you to go audio only. I know my camera is on right now, but when I teach normally, I do not have my camera on, and I tell my students that they do not need to have their cameras on either. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Number one, having a lot of people with video adds to the bandwidth that the synchronous session takes up. So that can be challenging for students who are on mobile devices or have limited data plans or have weak internet. Also, having the video on can make students very uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable sometimes to watch yourself be on the video or to think that other people are watching you in class. For students whose home may not feel as nice or fancy as other people, that can make them feel very uncomfortable. It can be very distracting for folks. And also, people are starting to discuss that it may contribute to Zoom fatigue. So I would really encourage you to think about not using the camera unless there's a clear pedagogical purpose for it. And then once you're done with that, turn it back off again and go audio only. Always have slides. Slides like what we see today, give students a place to focus. They're also an excellent place where you can not only have maybe a reiteration of lecture points, but it's where you put the directions for activities. It's where you put the text of the questions that you want to pose to students, right? So slides are really valuable. I also give my students access to the slides in the course management system a day or so ahead of time. So if they want to download the slides and take notes or get a preview of the day, or they want to review them afterward, they can do that. And students really like having access to the slides. I always arrive to class about 10 or 15 minutes early, and I strongly encourage my students to do so as well. And then we just have casual conversations. I think it helps students transition into classroom mode, kind of get settled, get their materials and their computer set up. And it's a chance for us to just check in. How are you doing? And hear students' great news. I had a student who got engaged this week, so that was really fun for everybody to hear right before class got started. I'm going to finish this slide and I'm going to scroll back and answer a couple of questions. Okay, once you're in the synchronous session, also, you really want to break it up. Even if you're going to have some chunks of lecture, interspersing that with opportunities for active learning, discussion, problem-based learning. Maybe you're collectively analyzing a primary source document or looking at an artwork or a map that students can discuss, having discussion, having small group work. That is really going to help students stay focused and engaged. If all you're doing is lecturing, again, not only could you have recorded it, very challenging for people to pay attention to that, right? And again, something as simple as encouraging the use of chat. We can see here, people are asking questions, right? So it's encouraging you to kind of think about what I'm saying and ask questions. And it also lets me know how my content's being received, and I can pause and answer questions as students have them, instead of having to double back to a point that maybe I had made half an hour earlier. So really looking for ways to build in some active learning and interaction throughout. Okay, so Amy's question, does lack of video reduce the feel of community? I have not found that. I think we can build community in other ways. through meaningful discussions, meaningful small group work, through the kinds of emails and feedback I give my students. Again, you can do small chunks of video too, right? So maybe in the 10 minutes coming to class, you have your video on. I have a colleague who subscribes to Powell's Books, the subscription service. And so about once a month or every 6 weeks in class, she'll do an unboxing with her class. And so she turns her video on and unboxes her new books and talks about them with students. So I think you can also find ways to use video that aren't as overwhelming as continuous video seems to feel to folks. Yeah, and I see some other comments along those lines too. Okay, I'm just going to skim through this really quick. And if I miss your question, please don't take offense or think it wasn't a good question. There'll be time to ask more questions a little bit later. I'm just trying to be conscientious about staying somewhat on track with the time that Elisa and I planned. Office hours and audio only. I think office hours might be a great opportunity to turn on video, right? Where now it's just a few of you and you want to feel like you're having a personal conversation. Okay, so how do we know students are present if we don't have video on? That is a great question, Stephanie. First, I want to set out, it probably depends on your students. So I teach graduate students. They are older. They're working on a professional degree for a career. They're pretty motivated to get to class. I do not typically have problems with students logging in and then disappearing, right? Also, my students are paying their own tuition, and I think they're very aware that they want to get the value out of their money. I think students are more likely to log in and walk away if you're only lecturing. If class is meaningful interaction and opportunities to learn, they are more likely to stay logged in and participate. But also, I think it's the activities, right? If students know that at some point in that time you're going to move to small group work, and their sudden disappearance is going to be very obvious when they don't move to the small group, they're more likely to stay in class. Kelsey, I give my small groups the option to turn on video if they'd like, so they have that freedom. Yep. Right, so again, different ways to do it. Okay, and also, you know, what I would say too is talk to your students. Find out what their preferences are. I think we can engage our students in how they want to make this transition to online learning, which many of them did not willingly sign up for. And so it's important to help them build the classroom community that they feel comfortable participating in and want to participate in. So here's an example, a quick example of a synchronous session. Again, the slides are in that Google folder, and you can take a look at this later if you'd like. I start every class with a quick welcome and a few announcements and a chance to ask questions about upcoming assignments or readings or things like that. And then I like to start that interaction really soon. So we start with usually a 5-minute chat discussion of the readings, and it can be very casual. What was the most interesting thing you read? Do you have any questions? What surprised you? What excited you about the readings? Or you can bring a more focused question. I might do a short lecture for 10 minutes, and then we might move into an activity. So we might do something like small group work. I give them directions. They have about 10 minutes to work in groups. And then when we come back to the main classroom, each group gives a quick report on their work. Then I might lead a class discussion. I always take a break. I teach 2-hour sessions. So I do think if you're teaching for more than maybe an hour and 15 minutes or so, you might want a 5-10-minute break in the middle for people to rest their eyes and stretch their legs. And then the second half of my class is probably another combination of activities and discussion and brief lecture. And then we might wrap up either with a summary of the day, looking ahead to the next week, or some kind of quick minute paper reflective writing kind of activity. I wanted to talk a little bit more specifically about small group work, which is a technique that I really love for active learning and getting students engaged and giving them a chance to work with one another. So some quick tips for that, because most of these online systems like Zoom and Collaborate will allow you to move students into breakout rooms. to work in small groups, and usually about 4, anywhere from 3 to 5 seems to be about the right number. Larger than that, it starts to get a little unwieldy online. But these are great for having students discuss something, maybe doing a jigsaw of your readings, some kind of activity, right? So they could go evaluate an artwork and bring back their analysis. You could have them go out on the web and locate an example of something that you've been talking about in class and bring it back to present to everybody. The first day of class, or the first day that we do small group work, I talk about guidelines for group work. So we set some norms for behavior. I like to stress the importance of drawing out quieter members of the class, listening respectfully, that kind of thing. In some cases, I will assign roles. So we might have roles like a moderator, a timekeeper, a note taker, a presenter. I usually talk a little bit about what those roles do, what their task is or responsibility is, and then I'll have them either pick their own, or I'll kind of force them to rotate. I'll say, oh, the first person listed in the group is the moderator. The second person is your note taker. Megan, jigsaw reading, remind me in the Q&A part and I'll explain it. And Melissa, 3 to 5 people per group. So the number of groups depends on how many students are in your class. Provide really clear directions. This is really important because unlike the physical classroom where you can kind of walk around if you see a group that looks confused, it's harder to do that when they're in these virtual breakout rooms. So I have written directions, really clear what they're doing, what the deliverable is, and you can put that on a slide for students to look at as you explain the group work. But then when they move to their group room, they're not going to see that slide. So if it's simple, I'll also paste it in the chat, because the chat sort of goes with them. They can still see the chat when they're in their group room. If it's complicated, I make a quick PDF of directions, put it in the course management system, push it at everybody as we start group work. Or because I often like to create a workspace for them, I'll do something like set up a Google Doc where every group has its own page, and I repeat the directions on every page, and then their group uses their assigned page for note-taking as well. You can do that with Google Docs. I've done it with Google Slides before. And then when the groups come back and you want them to report, everybody has the shared document already, and they can see what each group did, which is really nice. And then give them a time limit. I usually find 10 minutes minimum if it's a simple discussion. If it's more of an activity, they're probably going to need more like 15, 20 minutes. Just remember, it takes an extra minute to move into rooms, takes an extra minute or 2 for them to get organized. So that getting into the groups and getting organized just takes maybe a little longer than the physical classroom. Okay, I'm gonna skim through these questions really quick, and then Elisa, I'll turn it over to you. So the Google Doc, Gina, yes, you're right to be concerned about FERPA. I think it's okay as long as you keep it anonymous. So students don't have to be logged in with a name. They can, Google will automatically assign them an anonymous name. Or if your institution has something like Box, you could use that as an alternative. Joanna, remind me about the roles at the end, and I'll put a note in that folder. And actually I'll write myself a note. And I saw some folks asking about the jigsaw, and I'll put a note about that in the folder as well, or explain it a little bit later. Okay, so I think, so those were some ideas for synchronous. Oh no, I have one more slide. Sorry, Elisa. We talked a little bit about polling. We did Answer Garden. A couple other technologies that are really fun, and these are all linked on that resource list. Hypothesis is an app that you load a PDF, like a reading or a primary source document, give students access to it, and they can all collectively comment on the PDF using Hypothesis. So a really interesting way to engage students in a discussion, maybe even before class, or have them write comments and questions on your syllabus before the first day of class. Padlet is super fun. It lets you create boards where students can contribute text comments, but also they can share videos, images, they can share tweets from social media, and it creates a Pinterest style board. So it's great for things like brainstorming, or you want all of your students to go out and find an example of, you know, X, whatever X is, right? Like a piece of artwork that has a certain characteristic, and then they just share it in the Padlet. Kind of a nice alternative to forum discussions, which feel very linear sometimes. Timeline.js is super fun. If we have time, I'll show you an example of that. It creates interactive timelines, and you could use it yourself to create a timeline for students to look at, but I use them to have students create timelines. So I pick the subject, I set up the spreadsheet that you need, and every student adds one item to the spreadsheet, and it creates an interactive timeline from everything that they contributed. So that's really, really cool. And I mentioned Google Docs and Google Slides. Okay, so Elisa has a lot of experience teaching with asynchronous instruction, and she is going to offer us some ideas for how to engage students in that format.
Yes, thanks, Melissa, for all of the wonderful information on synchronous learning. As we all know, given the unpredictability of COVID-19, relying on synchronous online sessions alone is probably not going to be enough for most of us. And there are some obvious advantages to asynchronous instruction. For example, flexible scheduling for both students and instructors, which is important to note at this point with the strange things that are happening for all of us. Lower bandwidth. This is important because all of us have or will have students who do not have good internet access and who have a difficult time accessing video live. This is good to know. More mobile friendly, again, this is something that is more and more useful as students may find themselves in precarious situations in place and time as things progress. So I, as Melissa mentioned, have had a great deal of experience in teaching asynchronously. And I would just like to share with you then a few of the things that I learned sort of through trial and error, trying to create meaningful course experiences for my students. So effective asynchronous learning activities, if you would like to move to the next slide, Melissa, should not look exactly like synchronous ones. It is a great chance when you're teaching online to think outside the box. You can do things, this has come up several times already about doing lectures. I've found that doing something like short recorded lectures, so if you're doing lectures, expecting students to sit and listen to a long recording is not overly useful, but if you think about breaking them up into pieces, much like you would in a class, right? So I have a section I'm talking about, then if I'm doing a lecture in class, I would then throw a question to students, maybe show a video, do something interactive. So those are pause points where you could break your lecture up into different videos. Having guiding or response questions to help students focus on your lecture when they are not in a classroom of people who are all looking at you is a useful tactic. Those don't have to be graded. It can just be useful to help students listen to you in that way. Games and interactive web activities, you'll find if you go doing searches, as I'm sure many of you know, on your content items, that somebody has done a lot of work coming up with a really fun activity related to it, and is really easy to plug those things into an online course for students to use. Technology enhanced projects. This sounds really fancy, but basically, if you're having students do projects and they're already using technology to share them with people, it's a great opportunity for doing things like adding video. All sorts of things can be done in that way. And students might have the capacity to use technology in different ways that you haven't thought of. This is another great opportunity for asking them what sorts of things would they like to include. And this goes as well with presentations, which can be done in all sorts of formats by students. They don't have to be just recording themselves. They can be making animations, all sorts of things. Peer review can also be done online, just like it can in person, which is a wonderful activity. And discussion forums. So the ubiquitous discussion forum, which has come up several times, I have a lot of experience with. Melissa, if you'd like to move to the next slide. I feel like discussion forums are probably the most familiar of these tools to most of us. But I would also say they are the least understood. To avoid the many pitfalls of this form, I think it's important to provide guidelines for posts and comments. I cannot emphasize this enough in my experience. It is important to design purposeful activities and prompts. In other words, in order to have an actual discussion forum, you need to have a clear pedagogical aim, why you're asking students to do what you're asking them to do, why you're asking them to respond to the content, the material. Part of a problem that comes with discussion forums is the confusion between many years of a lot of us using our course management software provided by our universities to have students, for instance, post reactions or responses to readings before class, basically as a way to ensure they had read them, but those are not interactive posts, they aren't really interactive forums, and that's not really what a discussion forum is for, right? So in order to avoid boring posts, or what I like to call sort of social media syndrome posts, where they're a little too casual or a little too troll-like, it's a really great idea to include skills-based components. I have found that having students practice citation, it's a great opportunity for learning about citation and how to do research for something online, how to evaluate a source, to justify that source and talk about why it's important or why it is a valid source of information. Having them cite page numbers in readings when they're giving evidence to show use of evidence, all sorts of things that you can build into comments and posts so that more thought has to go into it than just, I like that, I didn't like that, I hated that. You really want to avoid designing prompts that can lead to that kind of response. And having them find articles, etc. But one of the greatest things is utilizing multimedia in the comments to avoid that those earlier problems I was discussing. So having students find maps or images or videos, artworks, etc., posting them, citing where they found it, and then explaining how this relates to the topic, to what the other student was talking about. And what you'll find is that once you start creating different levels of entry and interest into topics, that the threads take off on their own and students start responding because they're interested, not because they have to, and it can become very interesting and not boring for both students and for you. It's important to remember that you can do this in small groups. Almost all learning management software allows you to sort students randomly or to place them into groups for discussions. And in especially large classes, this is a really great idea for creating community. And the other important thing that I really can't emphasize enough is that you have to be present. And this comes to Megan's question here about advice for streamlining grading of discussion posts. So the first thing is, if you design your posts, your prompts, very, very clearly and specifically with rubrics, you will find that your grading is much easier. So if you're grading posts the way you would grade somebody speaking in class on participation, that's one thing. But if you're trying to grade content and form, you need something that can help you do it quickly and that can help students know what they're doing. So having something like specific questions saying you need to answer this in one paragraph and this in the second paragraph, or saying I require that you have X number of citations. So giving yourself something tangible, right, can help you can help you much more quickly see if they're meeting those criteria. However, at the beginning, you do have to put in time because this quality issue is the thing. The thread, the multimedia posts, all these things are interesting, but the thread itself is your classroom in an asynchronous course. Having these discussions is the point of contact between you and the students together. And so at the very beginning, you do have to be present. You need to model to them what this looks like. They need to know you're reading them. That helps a lot. And you have to give students feedback early on in the process to let them know if they're meeting criteria or not. And if they're not, you let them know and ask them more questions or let them answer more. And what I've found is that at the beginning of a term, there's a much more work on my part for training them to do this activity and grading, but as the term goes on, it drops off drastically, and they start doing this on their own. They start commenting on each other the way I would comment on them, and it's a wonderful thing to see peer learning happen, and that makes your grading responsibilities also much less. Melissa, if you'd like to move to the next slide. Oh, discussion in small groups via video or audio. That you can do, but that's really more of a synchronous activity if you're going to have them do video, unless you're having them post something and then post responses. I mean, you might find students would like to do things like do TikToks at each other. There are all sorts of ways that you could think about doing group work, but for forum discussions specifically, I think using a forum is great, and you will find students do interact. It can be a really meaningful way for students to work together. So all of this requires, as you have noticed, a lot of organization. And wow, we are in a time where that feels overwhelming. For fall, we have this whole situation where we don't know necessarily what our classes will look like. Some of you may have been given agency in deciding that, some may have not. Will technology be available to your students? If you, like I will be attempting to do, are teaching on campus and supposed to be live streaming to your students, will that technology work? What happens if you get sick? What happens if your students get sick? All of this requires such a great deal of planning. And I'm very much hoping that Melissa will be able to help us with tips on how to make this feel manageable. Just before I let go, just to Kirsty really quickly, I want to say asynchronous teaching is a lot of work. Yes, there's a misnomer that somehow teaching online is easy because you're not going into the classroom. Setting up a good actual online course is very heavy loaded in the front. It takes a lot of prep time, and if you organize it well and put a lot of work into it. However, when you go through the term, it actually is less time involved if you put the time in organizing and training the students in the beginning. So it's just as much work as an in-person course, but the work actually can be better as you go on in the term because you've put so much work into the beginning to helping students do peer learning together. Melissa, please help us.
I would agree with that, Elisa. And I would also say to Christy's question, I do find that if you are teaching online and from home, it can be very easy to let that teaching overwhelm your day, right? And feel like you lose your weekend or your evenings. I've realized in my own career that I have to create a schedule for myself. So first thing I do in the morning is I go through each of my courses, I read the forums, I make notes about student grades and that kind of thing. And then I'm done with forums for the day. And I typically don't revisit them unless I know that my students are working on a really complicated project and might be asking me questions, right? That might prompt me to get back in, but I really try not to do that. I have a time when I answer email. And then I really try to, I have course planning time in my week. And then I really try to disengage at other times so that it doesn't overwhelm me. And some weeks will be lighter and some weeks get heavier, but I do think it's helpful to kind of plan that out, to think about how you want your day to go. And if you have to work around homeschooling children or, homeschooling children because so many kids are going to be learning from home again, even if you're not truly homeschooling, right? You got to kind of figure out how you're going to work all that into your day. Okay, I'm going to read this question from John, and I think I might answer some of these questions with these tips. Okay, yeah. So let me actually give you some of these planning tips, and let's see if that helps with some of these other questions. So one thing I think is really helpful is to think about scheduling your course around weekly units, rather than maybe, oh, I have class Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday. If you have an asynchronous course, it's very typical that you present that each week to students. So here's the readings for the week, here's the video lecture you're going to listen to, here's an activity, and here's the forum requirement. And many faculty sort of turn on that week, maybe on a Friday, and students have a whole week to work on it, and then you turn on the next weekly unit. I don't turn off old units, but I sometimes kind of keep unveiling new information. Even if you have synchronous sessions, approaching it week to week is nice. And what I like about doing that too is I can kind of adjust the weeks as I go along. So if maybe a lot of students are starting to get sick, or it just feels like we're all have this kind of malaise and the work is getting a little overwhelming, well, maybe the next week I cut back on the forum posts and I make it a little bit less. And that gives everybody a little bit of a break. It's also really important in online courses to not just develop meaningful assignments, but to have them on a regular basis so that students' whole grade is not based on one big research paper at the end of the semester. So whether that's having grades for weekly forum discussions where students can see how they're doing and are also kind of building up some good grades as that cushion in the course, or you take some of those large assignments like a big research paper and you break it into drafts, right? You write a proposal for your topic, you have an initial bibliography, you have a draft that you're going to get peer feedback or instructor feedback on. It, first of all, helps students kind of stay engaged on a regular basis, not just checking out, but really doing the work every week. It lets you see how they're doing. And then if something happens later in the semester where, again, people start getting sick, it feels like suddenly this last couple weeks of the course isn't as high stakes as it might otherwise be if you just have this big research paper. Also really helpful to balance consistency and novelty. Keep in mind that students now will have 5 or 6 online courses, all these different due dates, all these different forms they're supposed to participate in. One instructor's having weekly synchronous sessions. Another one has these videos that go up they have to watch and respond to. You need to have really clear written expectations every week. I not only have a syllabus, I send a weekly announcement to my students and remind them, here's what you have to do this week, 1, 2, 3, 4. I have assignment calendars that list every single assignment for the entire semester that they can use as a checkoff. And I have very consistent due dates. So forum discussions, if it's an initial post, that might be due on Tuesday every week, and they have to respond to 2 peers by Sunday. But it's always the same every week. And again, students like it. It helps. It's easier to remember, to the point where they even say, oh, I suddenly thought it's Sunday. I haven't responded. I must have something due. I better go check. And then you balance that with some novelty. So yes, we have a forum every week with an initial post due on Tuesday, but the nature of that forum discussion is going to vary. So one week we might be discussing the readings, another week we're going online, as Elisa says, and everybody has to find an example of a video to discuss. So you kind of add some variation that way, but the overall structure is really consistent. And again, find ways that you can build in some flexibility. You don't necessarily have to plan every single forum discussion from August 18th through December 1st. What you could say to students is, we will have weekly forum discussions. I post the questions or the instructions every Friday for the upcoming week. And again, as you get to know your students, as you figure out what works, what you like, what they like, you can change and adjust and build in new ideas as the semester goes along. Just a reminder, of course, we want to think about accessibility for students with disabilities. Any videos that you select should have closed captions. We want to be careful that any readings or PDFs are accessible to a screen reader. So, always be thinking about accessibility. And then also think about how you can create a learning community, maybe not just for your subject, but a learning community around online learning. I think a lot of our students are rightly skeptical of online learning. If they didn't purposely sign up for this, right, they're suddenly just being forced into online learning. Many of our students, and I would include my own daughter, who was a high school senior, is now going to be a first-year student in college this year, didn't have great experiences with online learning in the spring. It was that emergency pivot, right? Everybody struggled. But be honest and transparent with your students. It's okay to say, I'm kind of new to online learning. I've done some professional development over the summer. I have some ideas. I'm really excited, but this is what I'm trying to do. This is why we have a forum discussion. And if you feel like it didn't go well, it's okay to say to your students, I feel like that forum discussion didn't go very well. What could I have done to maybe structure it a little bit differently? Have you seen something in another class that worked really well for you? Or gosh, I thought this activity was going to be so exciting and it really bombed, and I'm sorry, but thanks for giving it a shot. Like, thanks for being with me this semester. Model the learning process. Say, I'm learning to be a better online teacher as we do this. What great role modeling we can give to our students, right? And to each other, that it's okay. We don't have to have all the answers. We're in college to learn. They're learning, you're learning. Think about a midterm survey in your course. Maybe a month in, do an anonymous survey with students, even something really simple. What's working for you? What changes would you recommend? What could I do differently? What would help you? And see what students say. So again, it's just this idea of modeling being a learning community, and we're all learning to teach and learn better together. So with that, we have a couple discussion questions that Leah actually had asked us to pose for discussion. I made a note about a couple of other questions that were in the chat, and I'm going to scroll back up and try and grab some of those. We have about 10 minutes, and then we've got sort of the optional extra 15 minutes as well. So with this, we invite you to participate and respond to questions and one another in the chat. If you'd like to speak on the mic, we're going to suggest maybe that you raise your hand and keep any comments fairly concise so that more than one person has a chance to use the mic today. But we'll have a little bit of a either mic or chat conversation. Elisa, do you want me to start with a couple questions from the chat, and then we'll go to these planned ones?
Yeah, I think that's great.
Somebody asked about our headset mics. So I use a Logitech headset mic. I definitely find it gives me better sound quality for my students. I know some people just use a little set of headphones, and if that works for you, it's okay. I certainly think built-in speakers are getting stronger. But I find my headset mic very comfortable. I also have to laugh. My children and my pets actually understand what headset mic means. And if somebody walks into my office and I have my headset mic on, they very quietly back out of the room and shut the door. And even my dog knows that when the headset mic goes on, I'm teaching class, and she just goes to sleep. So I don't know. It's like a signaling device in my family, which is pretty funny. And it definitely gives you better sound quality if you are recording videos. I'd highly recommend it. So let's see. We've had a couple questions, Elisa, around, do we grade discussion posts? How do we ensure that students do some of that work? I would say yes, you do have to give grades for discussion posts.
Yes, I would agree. I think that if you're trying to get students engaged, it's the best thing to try.
Yeah. And I try to balance those points out with other assignments in the course. But so it's a small amount of points every week, but they do add up, and I warn students about that.
I will add that in an asynchronous course, as I tried to say before, the discussion forum is your classroom, right? So part of what happens in a discussion forum is that you're encouraging students to interact, but you want them to know that you're paying attention. So the question of the amount of time it takes you is a very, very legitimate one. Yes, it is time consuming at the start of a term to train people to use this new format well. That is usually time consuming, but I do want to add again that if you give specific instructions, your job and their job is much easier. So instead of giving a question and saying respond, you have to, my discussion post directions are paragraphs long. They explain the purpose of the assignment. They explain what I expect in responses. For some courses, I say, think of this as a mini essay. You will write 3 paragraphs, and in the first paragraph, you will address X. In the second paragraph, you will address Y. In the third paragraph, you will give examples using external sources and show me how you can cite them. So this all requires documentation, just like you would for doing in-class activities. But the more you do that, the easier it is to grade, and the better they do.
The other thing I would add, and I just realized maybe I want to have a cautionary note, your forum discussions can add up to a lot of posts to read and grade. So first of all, as you plan your forums, think about what's going to be a reasonable grading load for you, right? Maybe be careful you don't assign so many forum posts that you overwhelm yourself. The other thing to consider is that you don't, so when we talk about grading, you do not need to make detailed comments on every single post. That's not, to me, that's not what I do. I keep track that students are posting, keep like a little spreadsheet. Did they do their initial post? How many replies did they do? I think Elisa has a great point, which is the first couple weeks, you have to be a little more intentional and provide more feedback if they're on the right track. After that, I tend to either say like, you got the full points for the week, great work. Maybe I really enjoyed your comment about X, or I put that right into the form as a reply. I really enjoyed, this is a great contribution, thanks so much. Because then when I go do the points, I just put, okay, you got 10 out of 10 points. But you don't have to comment on every single post. I did have a friend who took over an online course for somebody. Her students had to do 1 initial post and 2 replies. So everybody was posting 3 times. That was 90 posts, 2 forums a week. That was a lot. She thought she had to reply to every single post a student made. No. If they're replying to one another, they're getting validation and feedback. So your role then is to go in and reply to a selective number of students, right? Maybe keep the conversation going, answer questions, address any problematic posts that you see. But also, you know, you can do some light grading of some of these forums, especially after the first couple weeks. Don't, like, just kind of, does that help? I suddenly realized that people might be thinking this means that you need to like make a detailed comment on every single post a student ever does, and you really don't. Don't go that far.
Yeah, no, I don't do that. No.
Yeah.
When I say modeling how to do this, I mean that when you first start the post, the initial ones, the first one, you go in and people are posting and you respond to people and you model what you would expect in a good post in a post. And then people who have done it really well, like you say, this is a really great example of using X, Y, or Z. So you did a great job using citations here. Or this is a really great point. I really love what you've had to say about this, and your example is really pertinent, but you're missing your citation. Would you mind adding it? So if you show that you're monitoring and then other students see that, then they start doing it. At the very beginning, after the very first one, I will go to the gradebook and put a comment for each student for the first one to say whether they met the, if they didn't meet the criteria, to say, here's why you didn't meet the criteria for this assignment. Depending on the size of the course, I might just send them a message, but I let them know what they need to do to meet the criteria, and then usually it's corrected. I mean, people want feedback, and when they get it, they correct it. But after the initial ones, it's actually much easier to monitor and grade.
To answer, Christy asked the question, motivating students when it's not part of their grade to post. I would, for all forum discussions, emphasize this isn't just busy work because we're online, but here's how it supports your learning, right? This goes back to Elisa stressing having these meaningful skill building forum discussions. The other thing you can look at is forum discussions where students really see the tangible benefit to themselves. So one thing I do in my classes is a lot of peer review. So you're gonna post your draft work, I assign you to 2 other people, you provide peer feedback, but you get peer feedback in return. So there's a very clear reason why we're doing this and how it's going to benefit students to participate in this activity. And sometimes they don't even get points for doing it. It's an expectation, or it's minimal points for participating in it.
The other possibility is if you have any control over other forms of assignments for the course, you can make these things mutually reflective. So they can refer back to each other, right? So that if I didn't participate in this thing, I'm gonna have a harder time doing this thing. Now the flip side of that is if people are sick, for example, you have to make things available to them. You can't close posts so they can't go back and read them. If you can record courses and make them available for students who are missing them and let them make responses. So I think making things accessible during this strange time adds a different level of flexibility, right, in how students participate in the course. And to someone's earlier point about due dates, for my asynchronous courses, it's really important that students not be overwhelmed with massive amounts of due dates, especially if they're switching back and forth. So I try to make the due dates consistent the same days of the week for the entire term, so that they know when they have to have their posts and when they have to have their comments. I also make in addition to a syllabus, I have a due dates schedule. I put the due dates in the course, and then I have a document that they can print or send or put somewhere, so that they keep track of these things. It's really
Assignment
hard.
calendars are amazingly popular, aren't they,
Students
Elisa?
love them, and
Yeah.
it helps you too.
I can post an example.
Yeah, it's really, really useful. And being clear about what is expected is so important. I cannot emphasize that enough. Making your expectations for them clear. And especially if you're switching back and forth, I don't think of asynchronous instruction in a hybrid course, which I will also be doing this fall, as, okay, so I'm going to replace these 2 class dates with these 2 things. It's more along the lines of, this is the asynchronous content for the week. This is the beauty of a weekly unit. And then we're going to do a discussion on this day in person. So the due dates don't have to be on class days, I guess is what I'm saying. And giving students a little more flexibility with that at this time especially is pretty useful.
Great. I think we need to turn this back over to Leah, because she wanted to wrap up really quickly and allow people to gracefully exit if you have another meeting. And then I think we're going to stick around for another 15 minutes or so for more chatting.
Yeah, I just really wanted to thank Melissa and Elisa for this incredible conversation. And it's also been just a wonderful model as to how to manipulate Zoom and use the chat. It's just been incredible for all of us to experience. So thank you so much for all sharing your knowledge with us. And we can make sure we get that link back up for anybody who wants the PDF.
Yes, let me grab that.
Also to follow up with us at renaissance@newberry.org if you have any questions. And we also hope to see you at the next meeting in 2 weeks about publishing. And anybody who wants to stay on, feel free for the next 15 minutes. We'll continue the conversation. Thank you.
And our contact information is in the resource list as well if anybody has follow-up questions, and I'll put them up on the slide here.
Yes, thank you, Center for Renaissance Studies.
It was such a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you all for joining us. If anyone has questions now or would like to speak, you're more than welcome to.
Yeah, Elisa has a question. Do you want to tackle that?
How do you stay conscious of a typical course load of a student? Yes, this is really important. This is why I think having a due date for things during the week that is consistent is important. Also, it's important to think about why you're having a student do something. So I think you'll find if you try to think in terms of I'm replacing classes, that you might have work you don't need. So if you think you have an overwhelming amount of work for your students, you might be asking them to do more than they need to do. The amount of time it takes to do something asynchronously counts for course participation time. So you don't have to have maybe even as many things as you think. And I think it's important to check with your students. I think Melissa mentioned this at another point, but check in with your students. To give a survey a few weeks in. Is this course load work too much? Are you finding difficult, time getting your work done in all of your online courses? And work with them. Assignment calendars to Jeffrey. I literally make a document that says due dates, and then I go week by week, because I think in weekly units of planning, I give my students weekly a piece of paper, or they can print it or not, but I give them a document, oh thank you, yes, that shows them by week. So I even set mine up that says week 1, week 2, week 3. I do the same thing on my syllabus, but in this case I make it a separate thing, and I won't put all the details I would put in a syllabus so that it's short. I try to make it on one page so they can just print it out and look at it, or have it next to their computer, if that's helpful.
So the advantage of that then is that they can have kind of one thing in front of them, and then the details that go into specific assignments, those are going to be in different files of your learning management system, different,
yes.
That's so that everything's available where you need it, when you need it, but this gives kind of a sort of modular overview.
So what I've found in asynchronous or online courses is that just having the syllabus is not enough. If you think you get a lot of questions or emails in in-person classes about material in your syllabus, just wait until it's all online. So having it in the learning mat, so when they open the class, one of the first things they see at the top is due dates, and they can click it. That will make your life easier because you'll get less messages about them, and it helps them organize their time. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, do you have some kind of system too in which those are hot linked, like they can click it and then it opens up to?
You can do that if you want. You can do that within most learning management systems. The issue is whether you're opening your, and this is something you have to decide, if you're opening your units by week or if you're letting students work ahead.
Okay.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. I also find it's more the reassurance. So all of these due dates are in my syllabus.
Of course.
But having this one-page assignment calendar that they can use as a checklist, that reassurance and that just that little bit of help getting organized, that seems to be what they need more so than the hot links to the actual assignment directions. Yeah,
I would actually suggest that only having one access point per assignment is much better for you and them in a module, in a course, because otherwise someone else I know who's teaching online has a situation where the software that they're using puts all of the assignments at the very end of the syllabus link, and they can click to them even if she tries to hide them, and they keep going in and answering the wrong discussions. So trying to streamline access makes everyone's lives easier.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think, so a couple people have asked about a jigsaw, so I'm going to explain that one really quickly. In a jigsaw, you break students into small groups. Let's say 4 students to a group, and each group has a similar but slightly different task. So I do these sometimes with readings, where I say to students, pick the reading of these 4 articles that's most interesting or relevant to your career plans, and then I break them into groups. And group A is all going to discuss Article A. Group B is discussing Article B. So they're all discussing their articles, but each group has a different article. After about 10 minutes, you break up those groups and you regroup, but each of the new groups has to have a member from each of the original groups. So now you have group 1 that has an A member, a B member, a C member, and each of those individuals is responsible for teaching the rest of the group about what their original group did. Does that make sense? And so what happens is, or you can also do this, the only example I have is kind of elementary schoolish, but let's say we're studying the life cycle of a frog. Each small group is responsible for a different stage of the life cycle. They learn about it, and then when they get together with their new group, they teach their group about that stage, and then they learn about the other stages from the other members of their group. That's a jigsaw. I like it as a way to especially if I have a week where I have a bunch of readings I think are really interesting, but reading all of them would be maybe a little excessive, then I might, again, ask students to pick a reading, or they sign up for a reading, which is nice, and then they only have to read one thing, and they learn about the others from the rest of the class.
So I would like to add, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, before our time completely ends, we didn't get to talking about the challenges of pre-modern studies or the challenges of some humanities topics in this format. And I just want to mention that I have had a lot of experience with controversial posts and subjects in teaching, the difficult things that we sometimes grapple with in humanities classes. And I've found that people will write things they would not say out loud. So having, being prepared for that, which I probably should have mentioned earlier, is really important. And having a response ready, how you will handle that in advance, right? And then also using it as an opportunity to teach about bias has been really useful. So I ended up developing assignments for identifying bias in statements related to use of evidence. That I had students do when this, came up in threads, and I ended up building it into one class's discussion thread, and it worked really well. But anticipating that in writing, people will say things that in person, if they're looking at you, they might not say. And they might not even realize the effect of that. They aren't trying to be offensive often. But I have had some really awful things said in a class and had to deal with that effectively. And I would also add that it is okay and maybe important at the start of a term to emphasize to students that if you're made to feel uncomfortable in a forum or by another student, please let me know immediately. So I actually make that statement at the start of the class. If you are ever uncomfortable or something has happened, because you're not constantly monitoring an asynchronous class. So if something like that happens, which I've also had to deal with, it is really important to let students know you are available and you are listening and you will help them, and then to address the situation. And again, those things that they should see when they first come into your course, like the rules for conduct are really important. I have students use full sentences and capitalization and not all caps, not acting like you're, typing something on your phone in response to a social media post. Those sorts of things matter, especially with students who are new to online courses, to help them learn that this is our classroom environment. And just because you're on the same screen that you would be, typing internet comments on, this is not that.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's just something I've learned over time, that it's important to be ready when those things happen.
Elisa, maybe you could share an example of your guidelines in that Google folder. If folks would find it helpful, if you've got one you're willing to share.
I have an example, and I have an example of assignments, an assignment that I made for some students. I'll look that up. Oh yes, the comments. Yeah, we can archive the comments, I think. Does anyone else have any urgent questions?
Okay, well, if not, we can say thank you again and goodbye, and hope that we will, again, I'll archive the chat questions now and try to connect them to the other documents so that you can have access, and feel free to be in touch with any other questions, and we will respond.
Actually, Elisa, could I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Sure, is this Gina?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect. I saw your comment that you had one more question.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Well, I don't mean to belabor this, but because there's not other questions, so I teach theater history over the course of 2 semesters at the University of Tennessee. And this is often, for many of my students, the first class where they come into contact with historiography. And so I like this idea of using message boards for source evaluation, potentially. Like, what's the difference between the New York Times or Wikipedia, a textbook, or a peer-reviewed article? So it sounded like you had some things in that realm with your own teaching in terms of like citation or source evaluation. So could you talk a little bit more about what you do with the message boards?
Sure. The first thing I do is start out explaining to people what is and isn't a good source. And one thing you could do is have a first assignment where they do an evaluation or a peer evaluation of choosing sources. The problem with all of these sorts of things is that they are often time and heavy for you. So if you start by asking people to find sources, then you have to help them evaluate those sources in the end. It was something you would have to grade. The other option is to have a list of sort of guiding questions. Students don't know where their information is coming from. I've found both for instance, in library scenarios and in class scenarios, that a lot of students don't know the difference between something that they get through a library curated source or a database versus anything they find on Google, because they now search those things essentially in the same way, and they don't really know the difference. So I would plug having your librarians do a virtual session on just this subject, because they are trained to do this. Instruction librarians do this very thing where they teach students how to evaluate a source and what a source is and what that means. And I would reach out to your library to ask if they could do a virtual little session, because most librarians are doing that, and librarians are excellent at instruction and instructional materials. That would be the thing I would plug most of all.
I also do an activity in one of my classes where I give them 5 resources about a particular subject. They're supposed to look at all 5 and then they pick one and discuss how they would use it for research. And then what I actually do is organize it in threads in the forum so that there's a thread where we're talking about source 1, source 2. And then at the end of the week, you know, I kind of jump in once in a while and make points, but at the end of the week, I do a summary of their comments, and that also gives me a chance to throw in any additional things I would want them to have noticed. But it kind of sets up, you know, now we're going to critique what is the difference, especially in the context of our class, between something we're pulling from the New York Times, a scholarly journal article, right? And it doesn't have to be one is good or bad, but just how do we use these in different ways? But that you might be able to use a first week activity to model that.
And I would just mention that if your librarians can't do that for some reason, that if you go and do some Google searches for library training materials for students on sources, you will find that librarians have made amazing resources for this, and they've made them publicly available to you. Mm-hmm. You won't have to make your own handouts or anything.
Yeah, there's tons of great stuff out there about how to evaluate sources.
Thank you so much for that great question.
Yeah, it was a really good question to end on.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Leah and Chris and Becky, for having us today.
Yes, thank you so much for organizing such a delightful conversation.
Yeah, thank you again. This is wonderful. And a couple people just asked about accessing videos for this session and others, and we are hoping to get this available quite soon. Just keep in touch, and I think we can follow up with you as well and others who are interested. So thanks again, and see you at the next session, hopefully. Yeah.
And yes, to answer Kirsty, I believe we are fine with you sharing these resources.
We are,
Melissa?
absolutely.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yep, thank
definitely.
you so much.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank
Have a great day.
You too.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.